A gray, August morning lake water, lying flat as a sheet of tin. Two kayaks drifted close to the far bank where wind couldn't reach, and there caught in a rack of roots and driftwood hung a sodden bundle of nylon the color of old bruise. They lifted it with both hands and laid it on the stones. The zipper was rust-welded, the baffles clumped, and beside it, half buried in silt, sat a scuffed plastic triceratops, no bigger than my palm. It made no sound when I picked it up. The little toy was cold and heavier than it should have been. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. I live on the south side of Boone, where the maples crowd the road and drop leaves thick enough to clog every gutter on my street. In October, the air at dawn comes in around the low 50s, and if the wind is right, you can hear the marching band from the high school practicing down in the valley. I retired from the Postal Service at 51, kept the early mornings, and traded the uniform for a faded flannel and a thermos of black coffee. That fall, my days had a simple rhythm: sweep the porch check on my neighbor's old hound drive out for feed and fencing staples, and be home before the sun turned the fog into steam. Boone is the kind of place that keeps time with porch lights and coffee pots. Folks measure distance in minutes to the parkway, and in how far a storm smells before it rolls in. On Saturdays, you can count the hikers by the number of out-of-state plates lined bumper to bumper at the trailheads. On Sundays, church lets out to a parking lot full of hugs you don't hurry. We talk weather deer, sign the cost of gas, and which trailhead still has a spot by 8. When the sky is clear, the Blue Ridge stacks up like ocean waves, one ridge falling into the next until your eyes go soft. Those mountains look gentle from far off, but they're steep and unforgiving when you're on their ribs. You learn to respect that early, or you learn it the hard way. Marcus Reed respected it. I met him years back when he came into the rescue barn asking about our first aid class. He was square-shouldered and curious, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. He taught weekend survival courses behind the Outfitter on King Street, dry tinder, simple shelters, how to read a contour line without getting fancy. His sister Emily lived a block east of me. Every March, she'd wave me down in my driveway to borrow a ladder and promise a pecan pie she might or might not bake later. Her best friend Sarah worked the counter at the diner off US 321, the one that sells grits you can cut with a fork and keeps the coffee hot without asking. Sarah called me Mr. Caleb, even after I told her to drop the Mr. The men rounded out the kind of group Boone produces when the weather turns, and folks want one last push into the high country. James Porter, tall and quiet, carried his pack like a memory from his Marine years, straps tight waist belt, bitten down. Tom Avery never could keep his camera zipped. I have a picture he took where the morning light runs along my porch rails like water. Daniel Cho had the quick, careful hands of a man who breaks down a gearbox for pleasure. Liam Hart, all eyes and ears, could whistle a nuthatch call and make you glance up. Ethan Miller was the kid 27, and Ernest always patting his pocket to make sure the little dinosaur hadn't fallen out. Chris Dalton was the steady one, the sort you want nearby when things stop making sense. I'd see them in 2s and 3s around town, James and Tom comparing trail maps, Daniel at the hardware store debating the merits of paracord, Liam crouched by the library hedge to study a Wren Chris, grabbing a to-go cup before a night shift. Boone is a wide circle, but the lines cross. If you stick around long enough, everyone becomes someone's cousin or coach or the neighbor who helped when the big branch fell after a storm. In the fall of 2020, when the leaves burned up the ridges and the mornings came clear, that circle felt tight and warm. My own life was ordinary in a way I appreciated more each year. Tuesdays were for groceries and oil changes, Wednesdays for the rescue meeting if we had one, Fridays for a drive on the parkway when the traffic thinned. My wife Ellen teaches 2nd grade. She marks time in lesson plans and read-alouds and the way little hands smudge the glass on the classroom door. We sit at the kitchen table after dinner, window open, just enough to hear tires humming on Appalachian State's brick streets, and if the air is damp, the smell of wood smoke from a few streets over. We talk about the neighbors who needs a casserole, whether the gutters can hold one more week's worth of leaves. It's a life built from small pieces that fit. There are scenes still bright in my head from the week before they headed out. Marcus leaned against his tailgate, showing me a waterproof map he'd marked in red pencil. He was particular, without being proud. He had 3 weather apps on his phone and 2 compasses in his kit. 3 days out and back, he said, tapping a loop that traced a neat arc. Emily rolled her eyes and tossed him a bag of trail mix. Sarah laughed and told me she'd tucked a Polaroid in her pack for the overlook. James checked the ankle-high laces on his boots by habit, the same way you glance at a lock you just set. Ethan fished out that dinosaur and set it on the tailgate like it needed a say in the plan. We stood there in light that made the dust look like glitter and talked about nothing urgent. The price of propane, the good trout hole off the service road, whether the leaf color would peak by the weekend. If there's a way to photograph the sound of people who trust each other. Tom nearly caught it that afternoon. In Boone, plans are promises. 6 o'clock is 6 o'clock when you tell your mother you'll call. Folks who roam the ridges also stick to rhythms because the mountains ask for it. Claire, who could run a fundraiser with a paper list and a pen, kept a small calendar stuck to her fridge with a magnet shaped like North Carolina. Under Saturday, she'd written 6 p.m. check-in. Paul had a habit of setting his phone alarm 5 minutes early and standing on his porch off Blowing Rock Road signal bar, pointed at the sky like a dowsing rod. Margaret played hymns slow and steady at church and wrote the same note on her own refrigerator, neat cursive soft blue ink. I saw the same time on the whiteboard inside the rescue barn, along with a phone tree, in case weather turned or vehicles failed. That week the air had the clean burn of apples and cold leaves. Daytime hung in the low 60s. Evenings dropped enough to make you check that the extra blanket was at the foot of the bed. The Blue Ridge Parkway ran like a ribbon along the top of all that color, and the trailheads filled early. A ranger I know said the ridge was quiet, no blowdowns, no washouts, nothing but traffic, and the occasional black bear skirting a trash can. In other words, the kind of perfect that can make even careful people relax a notch. We had our routines in town, the little rituals that make a place hold still. The diner's neon open flicked on before sunrise. The feed store bell clanged from a rope older than me. Out at the farmer's market, a man I've bought pumpkins from for 20 years measured the cold by how hard his knuckles went white when he lifted a bushel. I hauled wood, stacked it shoulder high along the fence, then took a slow drive east on the parkway to count the out-of-state plates. On the way back, the university's bell tower threw sound across the football field. Students laughed like they were inventing the noise for the first time, and the sky drew thin clouds into long, slow curls that promised a fair night. I remember thinking the weekend seemed set right where it should be. Faith in a place doesn't come from big gestures. It's a porch light left on until a set of headlights hits the curve. It's the way Paul's silver Subaru made the same hollow thump over the manhole cover 2 houses down. It's the rhythm of the church pianist's front door in the evening and the cheerful slam of the mailbox when the last letters drop. Those are small anchors, but they hold. I ran into Margaret that Friday afternoon, outside the grocery, 2 paper sacks balanced on her hip. She'd tucked a lemon and a bundle of parsley into the top bag like a porch bouquet. We stood on the painted feet where the clerk asks you to wait your turn and talked through our masks about nothing freighted trash pickup changes, the high school's away game, how the cold settles different in knees at our age. She said Sarah had promised a Sunday breakfast if the group came through town, early pancakes and eggs, and a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon. 6 sharp, Margaret said with a soft little nod. Not to me so much as to the week itself, like she was reminding time of its job. I saw James later that day, fueling up at the marathon on US 421. He gave me a half salute that said he had a list in his head and didn't want to lose a step. We stood with the pump ticking and watched a line of clouds scallop up over Howard's Knob. Good tent weather, he said, and I agreed. On my way home, I passed Tom's studio and caught him in the front window arranging extra batteries and memory cards, shoulders lifted with the quiet electricity of a man looking forward to light and open space. That evening, Ellen and I ate on the porch. The neighborhood was a string of tiny scenes, a boy riding a scooter in bare feet, someone setting a casserole on a railing to cool, a radio barking out football commentary from a backyard, a cat leaping from a hood ornament to the top of a fence, Across the street, Claire came out with recycling set the blue bin by the curb and lingered a beat too long with her hands on her hips, like she was counting something you couldn't see. The porch light over her door was already on, though the sky still held a decent blue. It wasn't worry. It was habit, the kind of ahead-of-time thinking that keeps life smooth. She lifted a hand to us and Ellen waved back. I slept hard that night, the way you do when the air comes cool through the screen and the bed has just enough weight to keep your knees from aching. Morning brought the smell of bacon from somewhere up the block, a lawnmower starting, and the soft rattle of a pickup with a loose tailgate latch driving down toward King Street. I took the thermos outside and watched the sun ease up past the ridge, thinned to a weak white by the mist pooling over the river. Emily drove by and honked twice, a cheerful sound under a sky clean as glass. Sarah texted Margaret a photo of a poly tarp folded just so. Margaret held up her phone to show me when I walked by, later proud of details that would never make the news. The day unspooled the way good Saturdays do. I fixed a squeak in the screen door, stacked a short row of kindling, and sat a while reading the sports page. In the late afternoon, I took a slow lap around the block and counted porch lights coming on one by one. A faint wind pushed down from the ridges and set the maples whispering. By 5:30, the neighborhood had settled into its quiet hour, a few dogs barking, a backyard grill flushing orange when someone opened the lid, a TV play-by-play drifting out and then sliding shut with a door. I walked past Claire's place just in time to see her tape a note to the inside of the storm door. 3 lines of reminders, ordinary as grocery lists, and smooth it with her palm. At 5:50, the sky softened to the color of skim milk. I rinsed my cup, clicked off the porch lamp, then clicked it back on out of habit, and set it low. The first chorus of crickets started. Somewhere down the street, Paul's Subaru shifted into reverse with that clean beep newer cars make. I stood there with my hands tucked into my sleeves, watching the corner where his headlights usually slid along the fence and then swung up across Claire's yard in a bright, familiar arc. They didn't turn the corner. The porch light across the street held its small circle on the steps, steady and patient, the way porch lights do when they're waiting on someone who is running a little behind. I stayed a minute longer listening for tires on the manhole cover, one sound among 100 small sounds in a town that still believed 6 o'clock meant 6 o'clock. Then I went inside and set my phone on the table where the signal is strongest just in case. It was the stillness that got to me first, that long stretch between 6 o'clock and when you realize no headlights are coming. By 9, the street was hushed, except for the cicadas pulsing in the trees. Claire's porch light still burned, throwing a small pool of gold across her steps. I could see her silhouette through the front window phone pressed to her ear, pacing. Paul's car hadn't moved either. When I crossed the street, she cracked the door before I could knock. Her face was calm in that way people look when they're waiting for sense to return to something that's gone sideways. "No call," she said quietly. "Not a text. You'd think at least Marcus." She didn't finish. Behind her, the kitchen clock ticked too loud. By midnight, she'd called the sheriff's line. They took her report, promised to notify the rangers at first light. I sat with her a while after that, the house breathing the way old houses do, every creak an argument for patience. She showed me the printout of their route, 20 miles round trip, a loop they'd done before. 3 days, 2 nights, clear skies, easy grades. Nothing that should have gone wrong. She pointed at the red line on the map with her fingertip. Marcus marked every water source, she said. He even left the coordinates on his phone. When she looked up, her eyes were dry but distant, as if she was already seeing through the paper and into the dark places beyond it. The next morning, I joined the first search team, leaving the trailhead. It was early October, still warm enough to sweat, but cool enough that the mist hung low, clinging to the ferns. We moved in pairs, calling names into the trees. Marcus, Emily, Sarah. The echoes came back soft and empty. By mid-morning, 2 more crews had joined from Pisgah. Helicopters passed overhead, their blades thumping hard against the still air. You could smell the fuel before you saw them. They circled in wide arcs, then dipped low over the ridges, throwing the treetops into motion like grass in the wind. But even from above, they saw nothing. Ranger Elena Ortiz ran the command post, a woman with the kind of calm that doesn't break easily. She'd been in search and rescue longer than most of us. Her voice carried just enough weight to quiet the chatter when she spoke. No signs, she said, glancing down at the tablet in her hand. No distress beacons, no flares, no footprints beyond the first 3 miles. It didn't fit. Marcus was the one who taught half this county how to signal for help. He would have left something, a rock cairn, a carved arrow, a ribbon of fabric. But the forest looked untouched. Back in town, the families gathered in the community center. Coffee urns lined the counter untouched. Margaret sat near the windows, her hands folded tight around a rosary. Paul paced, running his palm over the back of his neck. They had extra batteries, he kept saying. You don't just lose 10 people. The room was filled with the kind of silence that comes when there's nothing left to suggest but hope. By the second night, hope started to sound like denial. The search widened. Teams from 3 counties joined in. We combed the trails by daylight and ran grid sweeps after dusk flashlights cutting pale cones through the fog. Dogs picked up traces that disappeared near the creek crossings. A boot print once too faint to cast. A torn strap probably months old. Elena kept the log meticulous, every rumor, every lead. Someone thought they'd heard a whistle in the distance one night, but when we followed it, we found nothing but the wind moving through hollow logs. Days turned to a week, and the news crews came. They set up cameras by the trailhead and interviewed locals trying to squeeze answers from people who didn't have any. They asked about Marcus, about his courses, about whether the group had problems, debts, enemies. One reporter even asked if he might have led them off deliberately. I remember Claire stepping in front of the lens and saying, "My husband didn't run away from anything. He built our home with his hands. He came back from storms other men turned from." Her voice cracked on the word home. The reporter lowered the mic and backed off. When the first snow dusted the ridge in November, the official search wound down. Volunteers still went up weekends, but even that slowed. The command tent was struck. The maps came down. What was left was a binder of notes and a stretch of mountain that refused to give anything back. People move on quicker than you'd think. Winter does that, it folds things away. I kept a piece of the map pinned over my workbench in the garage. Ellen thought it was morbid, but I told her it reminded me that things unfinished still deserved tending. Every so often I'd drive out along the parkway, pull over at one of the overlooks they might have passed, and just stand there listening. The mountains have a way of sounding alive if you hold still long enough, water under rock wind against the evergreens, the distant rumble of a truck on 421. There were nights when I could swear I heard voices in it. Laughter may be faint as radio static, but I'd tell myself it was the mind reaching for pattern. 4 years is a long time to live with a question that doesn't change. By 2024, the case had gone cold enough that even the local papers stopped printing anniversaries. Then in late August, my phone rang just after sunrise. It was Ranger Ortiz. "You still around, Boone?" she asked. I said yes. "Get down to the station. We've got something." When I walked into her office, she didn't speak right away, just turned her laptop toward me. On the screen was a photo waterline pine reflection and 3 bundles tangled in reeds. Sleeping bags. The colors were faded, but I knew them. Marcus had bought those same models at the outfitter downtown, top of the line, the kind built for weather most of us will never see. Ortiz zoomed in on a patch of stitching. "These were pulled out of a lake up near Nantahala," she said. 2 kayakers found them yesterday. GPS coordinates line up with runoff from the same watershed they hiked toward. The image looked unreal, like something dredged from another life. She said they'd sent the bags to Asheville for analysis. "If they've been submerged since 2020, she said, we'll know." But the lab results told a stranger story. The fabric hadn't been underwater for years, months maybe. The material degradation, the algae growth, all pointed to recent exposure, as if someone or something had moved them long after the hikers vanished. By the time I drove up to the lake that evening, the place was already cordoned off with tape. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and silt. I met one of the kayakers, a kid named Jake, mid-20s, his voice shaking as he told me how they'd seen the first bundle bumping against a log jam. "We thought it was trash," he said. Then we saw the tags. His hands were still raw from dragging the gear ashore. Nearby, a woman I learned later, she was his girlfriend Mia, sat on a cooler staring at the water like it might give something back if she waited long enough. The forensics crew worked quietly, lifting each bag onto tarps. One zipper broke under their gloves, releasing a smell of mud and mildew that had been sealed for years. Inside one of the bags, they found a patch of fabric embroidered with a name, Sarah Cole, done in red thread. I stepped back when I saw it. The world didn't tilt, but it narrowed like a tunnel, drawing me forward, whether I wanted to go or not. The next weeks blurred together. New teams were called in. Drones, sonar divers. The lake wasn't deep, but its banks were riddled with feeder streams, narrow veins leading back toward the ridges. I joined one of the ground searches along a creek that ran north from the lake. The terrain was brutal, slick moss, sudden drops, brush thick enough to strip your arms. Every 100 feet we marked coordinates and snapped photos. That's how we found the first debris, a torn backpack strap, a water bottle with algae crusted inside a compass face cracked through the middle. Then in the shadow of a rock outcrop, something small and bright, a plastic dinosaur, its green surface dulled by grit. I knew it before the others even bagged it. Ethan's good luck charm. That night I sat in my truck at the trailhead until it was fully dark. The rain started soft tapping on the windshield building until the wipers couldn't keep up. I thought about Marcus's journals, the way he always wrote notes about the weather, like it was another living thing. He used to say, "The mountain has moods, Caleb. Best learn to read them before it decides to read you." Somewhere between the sound of the rain and the memory of his voice, I realized how wrong we'd all been to think that nature plays fair. Ortiz called 2 days later. "We've traced the debris line upstream," she said. "Ends in a ravine about a mile past the old service road. You'll want to see it." When I got there, the air was thick with humidity, the smell of turned earth and moss filling the gap between breaths. The ravine cut deep into the hillside, a wound carved by years of runoff. At the base, we found more shredded fabric, a buckle, and what looked like the edge of a tent pole jammed between stones. Ortiz crouched beside it, her gloves slick with mud. "Flash flood," she murmured. "Probably in that 2023 storm. It could have pulled everything down from higher ground." I watched the water crawl through the rocks, brown and slow, and imagined 10 people caught in that surge, one wrong step, the slope collapsing beneath them, the roar closing in. It wasn't a choice or a mistake. It was timing, pure and merciless. But even as that theory made sense, something about it didn't settle. The sleeping bags had surfaced too recently, too conveniently. And the plastic dinosaur, no flood should have left it sitting upright like that. It felt placed. Back in Boone, the news spread fast. 4 years of silence cracked open overnight. Folks who hadn't mentioned the hikers in months were talking again, trading theories at the diner. Some said the mountain had spit them out. Others whispered about hidden caves, even old mines. The sheriff held a press briefing, but all he said was, what everyone already knew: evidence suggests severe weather played a role. Investigation ongoing. I watched Claire from the back of the room. She stood still, hands clasped in front of her eyes, dry and fixed. When the cameras turned off, she looked at me and asked softly, "You think they suffered?" I wanted to lie, but the truth hung heavier than comfort. "I think they held on," I said, "as long as they could." The next morning, the recovery teams began mapping the streams, feeding that lake, every branch, every gully. I stayed on as a volunteer, cataloging debris, checking the erosion paths. By the 5th day, we'd moved higher up the ridge where the water grew colder and the light dimmer. That's where one of the younger rangers called out a shout that broke the hush. We climbed down and saw it together, a narrow gap in the rock face half hidden by vines, air drifting out cool and stale. Ortiz's light cut through the dark entrance, catching on something white just inside. Bones. She turned to me, her face unreadable. "We might have found them," she said. The rest unfolded in slow motion, teams securing lines, forensic markers, flashing like fireflies, the metallic smell of wet stone rising as they went deeper. I stood back, feeling the earth steady under my boots, but my chest hollowing out. For 4 years we'd looked for signposts, anything to say where they'd gone. Now we had one. It wasn't the kind anyone wanted. When the first body came out wrapped in plastic, the light had already begun to fade. The sky over the ridge turned the color of ash, and the forest went quiet in that eerie collective pause it takes before dark. I kept my hands in my pockets, nails digging into my palms, watching as the last stretcher passed. That's when I saw it again, caught in the mud beside the creek, just visible in the flashlight beam, a single footprint, small and sharp-edged, too new to belong to the dead. I didn't mention it right away. Some things you hold for a moment before you hand them over. But even as I knelt to look closer, a thought flickered through me like static. Maybe the mountain hadn't finished telling its story. Not yet. I remember the smell first. Damp rock, old soil, and something metallic beneath it all, like a faint breath of rust and time. The cave opening was smaller than it looked from the ridge half hidden by vines and shadow. We took turns ducking inside helmets scraping stone. The air was cool and still, untouched by wind. Ortiz went first, her flashlight beam steady as a heartbeat. I followed one step at a time, my boots sinking into soft layers of silt that muffled every sound except the drip of water somewhere deep inside. What we saw next froze all of us in place. They were there, 10 figures scattered close together in the narrow chamber. Years of damp had bleached their clothes into pale shades, but the outlines were clear. Some sat upright against the wall, others had slumped forward, gear stacked in a neat pile beside them. A line of stones arranged by hand divided the space like an invisible border. Ortiz whispered something under her breath, maybe a prayer, and then she raised her radio. Her voice came through calm and clipped calling in the forensic team. I just stood still, my light resting on a corner where a small bundle lay separate from the rest, a faded green sleeping bag, the kind I'd seen in Marcus's garage years before. We waited outside as the experts moved in. The forest was quiet again, the wind threading through the trees like a low murmur. I sat on a rock helmet in my hands, watching Ortiz take notes. No one said much. There's a kind of silence that settles over a scene like that. It's not respect exactly, more like disbelief, wearing a thin coat of discipline. When the gurneys came out, each one wrapped in heavy plastic, the sound of the zippers seemed too loud for the place. I counted them without meaning to. 10. Not a single one missing. The next few days passed in a haze of phone calls, press conferences, and procedures that felt colder than the mountain itself. DNA confirmations trickled in. The names were all there: Marcus, Emily, Sarah, James, Tom, Daniel, Liam, Ethan, Chris. I sat with Claire when the results came. She didn't cry right away. She just stared at the printout in her lap, then whispered, "At least we know." It sounded like a statement she'd practiced one meant to hold her together. Margaret clasped her hand across the table, and the two women stayed that way until the coffee in their cups went cold. When the lab reports came back from Asheville, the details painted a clearer, crueler picture. Marcus's skull had a fracture consistent with a fall. Emily and Sarah showed signs of prolonged exposure. No trauma, just the slow exhaustion of cold and hunger. Others had broken bones, rib injuries, bruises from debris. The cave had been their shelter, not their trap. But there were marks, scratches on the stone walls, uneven and frantic, like someone had clawed upward, searching for air or light. And then in Marcus's skeletal hand, they found a torn scrap of notebook paper sealed in a bit of plastic. The writing had faded in places, but 3 short lines survived trapped. Water rising. Holding on. Ortiz showed me a photograph of it the next morning. He tried to leave a record, she said, even at the end. I studied the handwriting, trying to reconcile it with the neat, deliberate script I remembered from his old lesson notes. The letters wavered, pressed hard in spots, as if his hand had been shaking. The forensic team concluded that a flash flood had ripped through the ravine during that record-breaking storm in 2023. Rock slides, water levels rising fast, everything matched. It made sense. But then Ortiz leaned back in her chair, tapping the folder's edge. "Still," she said quietly, "some of this doesn't add up." She showed me a photograph taken inside the cave, scattered debris near the entrance. A broken flashlight melted around its battery core, a snapped knife blade buried in the dirt. It didn't look like damage from falling rock, more like a struggle. And near the wall where the scratches clustered deepest, there was a faint smear of something darker on the stone. It wasn't human blood, at least not from the group. The lab would confirm that later. I started spending evenings at the ranger station again, helping with the old files. We pulled up the weather data, the satellite images, the early reports from 2020. Ortiz spread the maps across the table and pointed to a narrow corridor between the trail and the cave system. This whole ridge was unsearched back then, she said. Too steep, too unstable. They could have been trapped here the whole time. I asked about the sleeping bags that surfaced the timing, the strange freshness of the material. She nodded slowly. That's what bothers me most. The water damage suggests they'd been dry until the flood hit, which means they weren't sitting in that cave all 4 years. Her words hung in the air. We both knew what that implied. Someone or something had moved them. When the families were notified about the final recovery, Boone turned into a town of hushed condolences. The church bell tolled 10 times that Sunday morning, one for each name. I saw Claire walking up the steps with her son, his small hand gripping hers. She stopped, halfway, looked back toward the ridge line, and for a moment I thought she might turn around. But she didn't. Inside, the pews were full, the air thick with perfume coffee and the sound of people swallowing back emotion. The pastor spoke about endurance, about the mountains giving and taking. I didn't hear much after that. My mind was back in the cave on those scratches, that broken knife. 2 weeks later, Ortiz called again. The lab matched the foreign DNA, she said. It's from a male unrelated to any of the victims, no record in the national database. She paused before adding, but the trace came from one of the rocks near the entrance, not deep inside. Could have been contamination, but... She didn't need to finish. Her tone carried what we both feared. We met back at the site the next morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground slick and the air heavy with that clean, sweet smell that follows a storm. As we climbed down the ravine, I noticed small details I'd missed before: the way the vines had been cut, not torn along the entrance. The faint indentation of a boot print in the mud, recent and sharp-edged. Ortiz saw it too. She crouched, brushing away loose dirt, her flashlight tilting just so. "Too fresh," she murmured. "This wasn't here last week." We followed the faint trail up the slope, maybe 30 feet, where it vanished into a cluster of laurel and rock. That's where we found it, a rusted shovel with duct tape around the handle, half buried, its blade crusted with old soil. It looked out of place, deliberate. She lifted it with a gloved hand, turning it under the light. The letters RC were carved into the wood. Back at the station, she had the shovel tested. Within days, the results came back: blood traces, both animal and human. And along the edge, microscopic fibers matching those from one of the hikers' backpacks. Ortiz's expression hardened when she read the report. "Someone was here," she said. "After the flood, maybe before. We need to find out who." That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on my porch, the wind rattling through the pines, thinking about that footprint, the initials, the misplaced sleeping bags. Every answer we found seemed to open another door. I kept seeing Marcus in my mind, standing on that trailhead, map in hand, confident and steady. It hurt to think that his final note holding on might not have been about weather at all. A few days later, Ortiz asked me to join her on a trip into town. She wanted to speak with a trapper named Amos Reed, no relation to Marcus, but one of the few who still worked the deeper forest after dark. We met him outside a bait shop near the county line, the place smelling of oil and tobacco. He was wiry, gray-bearded, with the look of someone who'd lived too long by instinct. When Ortiz showed him the photo of the shovel, his eyes flicked down and then away. "I've seen one like it," he said. "Couple years back. Man with a limp was using it to dig up ginseng near the ridge. Scar across his face right here." He drew a finger along his cheek. "Didn't catch his name. Folks called him Rusty, I think." Ortiz jotted it down. Rusty. It was a thin lead, but in cases like this, thin leads sometimes held. She ran the name through the database later that day. A match came back: Randall Crowe, 45 prior arrests for assault and poaching, last known address, a trailer straddling the Tennessee border. The file photo showed a man whose life had been hard and unrepentant, a pale scar cutting from his temple to his chin. The limp, the alias, it all fit. When Ortiz told me, I felt a chill crawl through me that had nothing to do with weather. A man like that living off the land could have crossed paths with anyone, but 10 hikers. And what then? Robbery territory, panic. It was all speculation, yet every detail nudged the story further from accident. Within a week, state investigators took over. They sent agents up from Nashville, their trucks lined along the ranger lot. Ortiz stayed on as liaison. I stuck around unofficially, doing what I'd always done, keeping watch, asking quiet questions, waiting. The nights in Boone felt different now. The mountains loomed less like guardians and more like witnesses. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like a whisper from somewhere we hadn't looked yet. One evening, Ortiz called again, her voice tight. "We found something else," she said. "About a mile from the cave. You'll want to see this." When I arrived, the site was marked off with tape and floodlights. She led me to a flat section of ground where the dirt had been freshly disturbed. They'd unearthed a fragment of fabric canvas, tan-colored, torn from a jacket sleeve. The lab would later confirm it belonged to the same brand Crow was known to wear. But what caught my eye was a dark smear along its edge, half hidden under the mud. Ortiz crouched beside it, running her finger just above the surface. "More blood," she said quietly. Same unknown DNA as before. Standing there, I realized the story we thought we'd finally closed was about to break open again. The mountain had held its silence for 4 years, but it wasn't done speaking. Somewhere out there, the man who'd carved his initials into that shovel was still walking, still hiding, still believing the woods would keep his secrets. The wind picked up, rustling the trees in a long, slow breath that sounded almost like a warning. I looked at Ortiz, her face drawn and determined under the floodlight's glow, and I knew whatever peace we thought we'd found in that cave was only temporary. The truth was still moving through those hills, quiet as an animal waiting to be caught. The day they confirmed the blood on that torn sleeve belonged to a man named Randall Crow. I remember the weather turning. A thin drizzle hung over Boone, too light to soak through, just enough to cling. Ortiz stood by the ranger truck, coffee steaming in her hand, eyes on the tree line, like she was waiting for something to move. "He's out there," she said. Or he was. I could hear the fatigue in her voice, the kind that settles after you've spent years chasing ghosts, only to realize one of them might still be breathing. Crow's record wasn't long, but it was ugly. Bar fights, theft, poaching citations. One assault charge dropped when the witness vanished. He'd lived rough, the kind of man who slept where he worked and left before dawn. Ortiz called him a drifter with a routine. She meant the kind of routine that circles the same back roads until nobody remembers when he arrived or when he left. They traced his last known location to a rusted trailer near the Tennessee line. When we got there, the place felt wrong before we even stepped out of the truck. Grass, waist-high males stuffed tight into a box, a broken porch light swinging in the wind. The front door wasn't locked. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint sweetness of something rotting under the floorboards. There wasn't much, just a mattress, a table, a stack of hunting magazines curled from damp. But in the corner, half covered by a tarp, lay a pile of burlap sacks filled with dried ginseng roots, each tagged with a year. The most recent was marked 2020. Ortiz crouched, peeled back the tarp, and found a spiral notebook wedged beneath it. The cover was stained, the pages brittle at the edges. She opened it carefully. The handwriting slanted hard to the right, cramped and impatient. Most of it was numbers, weights, prices, coordinates, but one entry stood out, written darker than the rest. "Big score, 10 fools, left 'em to the flood." She read it twice before meeting my eyes. "That's our man," she said quietly. We spent the next week combing through everything that notebook hinted at Root's buyer's drop points. Each clue led deeper into the same woods that had taken Marcus and the others. There was no record of Crow leaving the state, but no trace of him anywhere nearby either. It was like he'd folded into the tree line and disappeared. Still, the discovery changed the tone of everything. The tragedy we'd mourned as an accident now had a face behind it, and for the families that made the grief sharper. Claire came by the station one afternoon, her son waiting in the truck. She asked to see the notebook. Ortiz hesitated but nodded. Claire ran her fingers over the ink, the small loops and pressure marks that spelled out the confession. "He wrote this like it was business," she said. "Like my husband's life was a line item." She closed the cover gently and handed it back. "Find him," she whispered. The investigation widened. The TBI came in their black SUVs parked in neat rows outside the ranger office. They brought drones, sent dogs, even thermal imaging. Every ridge, every ravine was walked again. Each discovery, a bottle cap, a scrap of canvas, a rusted can, was logged and tagged. One afternoon, a diver team recovered a tarp from the same lake where the sleeping bags had surfaced. The tarp was tangled in roots 10 feet below the surface. When they laid it out on the bank, the mud peeled away in sheets, revealing a smear of blood across one corner. Lab tests came back fast, Crow's DNA. He'd been there not in 2020, but recently, maybe weeks before. That night, Ortiz called an emergency meeting. We sat around the table, a half dozen of us, the rain tapping on the windows. She pulled up a map dotted with pins, Crow's old campsites, his routes, his buyers. "He's been moving," she said, "even after the storm. My guess is he came back to clean up what he left behind." Someone asked what that meant exactly. Ortiz looked down, then said, "Gear, evidence, maybe even trophies." Her voice stayed steady, but I could see her hands tremble when she folded the map. "We'll post patrols around the lake," she added. "If he's still using those trails, he'll show himself sooner or later." The waiting was the hardest part. Days blurred together, fog rolling over the mountains, radios crackling, boots crunching over wet leaves. You start to wonder if the forest itself is alive, shifting around you just to keep its secrets. Late one evening, Ortiz and I sat by the edge of the lake, our flashlights dimmed, listening to the water lap against the rocks. She broke the silence first. "You ever think about what keeps a man like that alive out here?" she asked. I told her I didn't know. She nodded like that was the only honest answer there was. He's survived this long because he knows when to hide. But storms don't care about hiding places. Around midnight, a ranger radioed in movement on the north bank. Thermal picked up a single figure limping, carrying something. We were there within minutes, lights off the only sound, the quiet slide of the river below. But by the time we reached the ridge, the figure was gone. In his place, a small campfire, still smoldering footprints leading down slope, and a torn piece of canvas caught in the branches. On it, burned into the corner with what looked like a heated knife tip, were 2 letters, RC, the same as the shovel. We followed the trail until it vanished in a wash of gravel near the creek. The rain started again, hard and cold. Ortiz cursed softly under her breath. We searched until dawn, then turned back empty-handed. The next morning she gathered us again, exhaustion carving shadows under her eyes. "He's close," she said. "But if he's wounded, he's desperate. Don't assume he's running." The tone in her voice told me she thought the opposite. A week later, a trucker in West Virginia called in a tip, a man with a limp, hitchhiking, north-scarred face, carrying a duffel that looked heavy. He'd taken a ride to a rest stop near the state line and vanished into the woods. The description matched Crow perfectly. Ortiz sent his photo to every ranger station and pawn shop from Asheville to Canada. Within days, reports trickled in a sighting near the border, a sale of camping gear that matched Marcus's team's brands, a handful of rumors that stretched truth thin but kept us moving. The families followed every update. Claire asked for details. Margaret wanted silence. Paul came by the ranger post one afternoon with a folded newspaper under his arm. "You think he'll ever stop running?" he asked me. I told him maybe the mountains would catch him if we couldn't. He nodded, eyes far away. "Then let the mountain do it," he said. By early September, a break finally came. A trapper in Quebec reported trading goods with a limping man at a lakeside cabin, ginseng roots pelts, and a pocket knife with a carved handle. When he saw Crow's photo, he said, "That's him. Left 2 nights ago heading east." Ortiz and the TBI crossed the border within hours, coordinating with Canadian authorities. I wasn't on that trip, but I followed every update from the radio room. They reached the cabin at dawn. The air inside was heavy, smoke-stained. On the table sat a bloodied bandage, a knife, and a notebook filled with more ginseng tallies. On the last page, scrawled in shaky letters, it read, "The flood took what it wanted. The rest I buried." No sign of Crow. Just the slow creak of wind through broken boards and the echo of a man who'd survived too long on other people's lives. When Ortiz came back, she looked 10 years older. "He's hurt," she said. "He won't make it far." I wanted to believe her, but I'd learned the hard way that the woods could hide anything, even a wounded man. That night we stood by the lake again, the water reflecting a thin slice of moon. The air smelled like pine and rain-soaked soil. Somewhere beyond the dark tree line, something moved, maybe wind, maybe memory. Ortiz said softly, "You know I used to love these mountains." I didn't answer. We both knew that love changes after you learn what the ground can keep. A few days later, divers went back down one last time, scanning the deeper channels where the lake met the feeder creeks. They found nothing living, but near the silt bed wedged between stones, they recovered a second tarp. Inside it were remnants of gear, part of a camera, a cracked watch stopped at 3:17, and a rusted lockpick etched with small letters, RC. It was proof, but it wasn't closure. Not yet. When I left the site that evening, the sun was just dipping behind the ridge, turning the water copper. I thought about Marcus's note holding on. 4 years of silent storms and strangers moving through the same woods, and somehow that phrase still fit. The families had something now, truth, if not justice, but the story wasn't finished. There was still one more turn in the trail, one more breath left in the mountain. And somewhere out there under those endless trees, a man with a limp was either dead or waiting to be found. The water was quiet that morning, the kind of still that makes every sound feel borrowed. Mist hung over the lake like smoke, softening the line between air and reflection. I stood beside Ortiz at the edge of the dock while divers hauled in the last of the equipment. The case wasn't technically closed, but it was ending the way some stories do, slowly, without ceremony, like a tide pulling back after a long storm. The air smelled of wet pine and fuel. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, how wrong that peace felt, knowing what had happened beneath that surface. 2 days earlier, the call came in from across the border. A trapper had found a body tangled in roots near the shoreline of a frozen pond north of Quebec. A man, mid-40s, leg broken, face scarred. Nearby, an old duffel filled with dried roots and tools. The authorities confirmed what we already knew in our bones. It was Randall Rusty Crow. No one knows how long he'd been there. Judging by the frostbite and the state of his camp, he'd been dying slow. Exposure, infection, maybe both. His trail had ended the same way it began, in the wilderness, alone, swallowed by the kind of quiet he'd once used to hide his crimes. Ortiz didn't say much when the news came through. She set the report down, folded her arms, and stared at the wall map that had guided every search. "It's over," she said, but it didn't sound like relief. Maybe because for people like her, and for those of us who'd lived this story up close, there's no such thing as over. The families came by the next day to hear it from her directly. Claire listened without flinching, her hands folded around her son's. When Ortiz finished, Claire just nodded. "He died in the cold," she said. "Good." Then she looked at the floor, as if the word had come from someone else entirely. Margaret wept quietly beside her. Paul stood behind them, his face hollow, like a man who'd run out of things to fight. They thanked Ortiz, thanked the Rangers, and then left together. I walked them to the parking lot. Claire turned back, once her son still holding her hand, and asked, "Do you think Marcus knew what kind of man he was dealing with?" I told her I thought Marcus knew fear when he saw it, but I also thought he believed he could reason with anyone. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "That sounds like him," she said, and got into the car. In the weeks that followed, the case file thickened with closing statements, forensic reports, and paperwork that would outlast all of us. The cave was sealed, the site declared protected ground. A memorial plaque went up near the trailhead, 10 names engraved in brass, the metal already darkening under the mountain air. Folks came to leave flowers, hiking patches, bits of cloth. A small plastic dinosaur appeared there one morning, no one sure who'd placed it, but everyone knew what it meant. I drove out there once at dawn, stood in front of that plaque, and read each name out loud. It felt like the least a man could do. Ortiz retired that winter. She said she'd had enough of ghosts. Before she left, she stopped by my house with a cardboard box full of case photos. "Don't let the story die with the file," she said. I promised I wouldn't. We sat for a while on the porch, the air crisp, the ridges sharp against a pale sky. She asked if I still walked the trails alone. I told her not as often anymore. The woods hadn't changed, but something in me had. "Funny," she said, "how the same place can mean 2 different things depending on what you've seen there." Then she laughed once, soft and tired. "You'd think after all this I'd hate the mountains." She looked toward the horizon, her breath showing in the chill. But I don't. I just listen to them differently now. Life in Boone slipped back into rhythm as it always does. The diner reopened under new management, same coffee, same squeaky booth where Sarah used to sit. The community center holds a memorial hike each October. Now nothing formal, just locals gathering to walk the lower loop, leaving small tokens at the overlook. I join them sometimes trailing near the back, watching the new hikers laugh and take pictures. They never see the scars in the land, and maybe that's for the best. Time softens what memory keeps sharp. Claire eventually moved to Asheville closer to her sister. Her boy Marcus's boy is a teenager now. He volunteers with the Search and Rescue Youth Program. Ortiz told me she heard him speak at a local school teaching kids how to prepare for wilderness trips. He closed with a line that sounded too wise for his age. "Respect the mountain and it'll respect you back." I suppose that's something his father would have said. As for me, I stayed. I still walk the ridge on clear mornings, still check the rescue gear once a month out of habit. Sometimes I'll find bits of old rope or a torn glove, half buried in the mud, reminders that the forest keeps everything, even the small forgotten things. I don't go near the ravine anymore. The earth there feels uneasy, as if it remembers too. But on quiet nights when the wind is steady, I can almost hear the rush of that storm in 2023, the one that unearthed the truth. The sound isn't angry, not anymore, just part of the weather. The story of those 10 hikers lives on here in subtle ways. There's a foundation now. Claire helped start it with donations that poured in after the documentary aired. They call it the Echo Project. It funds emergency beacons for hikers and supports small search teams in the Carolinas. Every brochure carries a photo of the Blue Ridge at sunrise, a line underneath. For those who never came home and those who still wait for answers. People stop to read it in grocery lines, not realizing that the man next to them, me, was there the day the first search began. I don't tell them. I've learned that silence can carry truth just as well as words. Sometimes, though, late at night, I'll take the old file Ortiz left me and open it to the page with Marcus's final note. The paper's yellowed now, but the words still cut clear. Trapped. Water rising. Holding on. I think about how he must have written it, his hand shaking the ink damp from the cave air. Some people call that courage. I think it's something quieter. A man doing what he's always done, leaving a sign so others could find their way back. Crow's death never brought the satisfaction anyone hoped for. There was no courtroom, no apology, no moment where justice stood taller than loss. Just a name on a file, a body in the cold, and a story left to be told by those who couldn't forget. But I've come to believe that's what justice looks like sometimes. Not triumph, but endurance. The simple act of remembering when it would be easier to move on. I still see Ortiz now and then. She works part-time teaching environmental safety courses, says she sleeps better now that she's off the field. When we meet for coffee, we don't talk much about the case. We talk about her daughter's wedding, about the road construction on 421, about small things that mean the world when you've spent years chasing darkness. And every once in a while she'll pause mid-sentence, look out the window toward the distant ridge and say, "They were brave, you know, all of them." I always nod because I know she's right. The mountains around here don't change fast. Seasons roll over them like slow waves, and the trails fill with new sets of footprints that will fade by spring. But if you walk the right one just past the old trailhead where the plaque stands, you'll see a small wooden box mounted to a post. Inside are notebooks where hikers write their thoughts before heading up. Most entries are simple. Great day for a hike. Saw a deer near the ridge. Every so often, though, someone writes a name. Marcus, Emily, Sarah. 10 names that once echoed through search radios, now written in graphite and grace. When I finish reading those pages, I always close the box gently. The woods are loud with birds again, the air sweet with pine and rain, and I know the world keeps moving. But every time I step back onto the trail, I feel a kind of weight that isn't sadness exactly. It's something closer to gratitude. That even in their final hours, those 10 souls left behind more than fear. They left proof of endurance, proof that even when the storm takes everything, there's still a chance for light to find its way through the cracks. So when people ask me why I still tell this story, I tell them it's not about the crime or the man who caused it, or even the search that followed. It's about remembering that the line between safety and loss is thinner than we want to believe, and that when it breaks, all we can do is hold on to one another until the water starts to fall. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because the mountains remember even when we forget, and sometimes that's the only kind of justice the world has left.